Hello and welcome to another podcast of Father and Joe. I'm Joe Rocky here with Father Boniface Hicks. And Father, today's topic is going to be about the fact that you guys just elected another abbot. And since I really don't know the right questions to ask, I'm just going to give you the floor right off the bat here. We'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, it's such a unique thing in the life of the church that a lot of people wouldn't encounter it, except that, there have been press releases and things like that that come out and indicates the new abbot, the 12th abbot of St. Vincent Archabbey, uh, now Archabbot Martin Bartle. We just elected him on Tuesday. And it's an interesting thing. It starts to, you and I have talked before, Joe, about different religious orders and talked a little bit about those spiritualities. I'm a Benedictine, and people often know Franciscans or Jesuits or Dominicans or whatever. And what is the difference between these religious orders? Well, there's some dimensions of our spirituality. Monks make a vow of stability, for example. So we live in a particular place and we sanctify that place, and that place becomes also a sanctifying place. Other people come, make retreats here, visit here, are involved in the life of our monastic community in some way, and they are touched by God's grace through that process, and it becomes sanctifying. They become more holy through their interactions. But monks live in a place. Franciscans are all over the place and do a lot of preaching and movement around. So different spiritualities in the church have been developed by different saints throughout the last 2,000 years of the church. We also know that different religious orders all make vows more or less of poverty, chastity, and obedience. That vow of obedience is a pretty interesting thing, and people will sometimes think about what that means. What does it mean to have a vow of obedience? Obedience to whom, and what are the limits on that, and what's that all about? And well, every religious order has some kind of governance structure. It has some structure of authority and responsibility for the life of the community. And there's a just as our, every country has a governance structure, and our country famously has these three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, and there are checks and balances. But the framers of the Constitution had to make all that stuff up. I mean, there's no government kit creation mechanism. They had to draw from existing structures. Anyway, just as nations have governance structures, religious orders have governance structures, as companies and those sorts of things have governance structures. How do you get people into place? Well, we know we elect a president. We elect him for 4 years. He can be reelected for one term. That's the head of the governance structure. He appoints several other elements underneath that. So just getting people thinking about governance structures. How does a CEO come into power? Well, maybe he buys the company, creates the company, is elected by a board of directors. You could see there are a lot of different ways to do these things. How long does the CEO stay in power? Well, maybe 5 years, maybe as a term, maybe he stays in as long as he wants to until he feels like resigning. You can make all those different kinds of decisions. Well, religious orders are similarly variable, and the way that they elect a governance structure, the way that we can put laws into place, the ways that we adjudicate different situations, we have to deal with all of that. All kinds of freestanding societies of people need to have some structures like that. So, in the case of uh, our Benedictine monastery, we elect an abbot. Abbot is just related to the word father. Abba means father in Hebrew. And so the abbot is the father of the monastery. And St. Benedict has a fair amount of teaching about the abbot, about his role. And he does have authority over the monks. We make our vow of obedience to the abbot, and he has quite a bit of leeway. For example, to say I can't do this podcast anymore, then I can't do this podcast anymore, just to make it real immediate. He has a fair amount of leeway in exercising that authority. Now, he has to do that in accord with divine law, divine authority, and he doesn't have all the power. He's also limited by church law and by the statutes in our congregation. For example, the statutes that govern our Benedictine congregation say that a monk can't be assigned outside of the monastery. So, for example, our Benedictines are in the Diocese of Pittsburgh at the St. Francis Cabrini Parish in Aliquippa, and the abbot cannot say to me, I want you to go and be pastor there. He could say that to me, but he can't force me. I have the right under law to say, no, I want to be here at the monastery. You can't assign me outside of the house without my agreement, without my permission. It's not disobedient of me to say that. So just a little example. The abbot does have limitations on his authority, but he has a lot of authority over the monastery. So we really do look to him as a father in Christ. It's not about power plays and working out authority issues and things like that. We look to him as a father in Christ, and we trust in his discernment, and he trusts in our discernment as well. I mean, there really isn't a kind of forceful application of authority uh, generally in monasteries in the modern day. A little bit more dialogical. But at the end of the day, he makes the decisions, and we do what he says, and we trust that God really works through that. And so it's a beautiful faith dimension of our life in a very concrete form. My faith says that it's Christ who's making this assignment. And I've seen with our past abbot, times that he told me to do things that I thought were, why would I want to do that? I'm not interested at all. Or times that I really internally resisted and was very skeptical, even pushed back in some ways. And again, I could see the hand of God at work. Just amazing. So that really does happen. But how do you get an abbot is the question. I've told you a little bit about what an abbot is and what the stakes are. Again, I'm electing somebody, we're choosing somebody who has really, for all intents and purposes, total reign over my life. I mean, who can just stop everything that I'm doing and send me in a completely different direction. And as much as that wouldn't normally happen because we talk about it, it can happen. He has the authority to do that, and I made a vow that I would respond to it. So that's pretty high stakes in this decision. As Benedictines, because he's a father of the monastery, we also elect an abbot for a pretty long period of time. At the beginning of our monastery in 1846, the practice was all the way up until 1963, the practice was to elect the abbot for life. So the abbot, until he dies, would be abbot of our monastery. Now that changed in 1963. We revisited our constitutions after the Second Vatican Council, and we adjusted that. We now elect him to age 75. So it's like a bishop that way. Bishops are also required to resign at age 75. The Holy Father can keep a bishop on longer if he wants to, but the bishop is required to resign at 75. And likewise, we elect our abbot to age 75. It's possible for us to re-elect him for 8 years at a time, but he has to resign at age 75 and we have a new election. The abbot who just resigned, Archabbey Douglas Nowicki, had been our abbot for 30 years. So that's a long time to elect somebody and a pretty huge decision. I've only been a monk for 22 years. So my entire time as a monk, I've only known one abbot. I've only been under obedience to one abbot, I should say. There's only been one abbot of St. Vincent, Archabbey. Uh, Now, in this case, we ended up electing Father Martin Bartle to be abbot till age 75. He's already 65, so we're electing him for 10 years. We could potentially re-elect him in 10 years for another 8 years at a time. So it's possible we could keep sentencing him to be abbot till death. It is a huge responsibility to be the abbot, especially of a community of about 160 monks. There were 138 electors. So all monks in solemn vows get a vote. And then we have another 12, 15, 20 monks who are in formation. And so it's a huge monastery. We're the largest Benedictine monastery in the world, and becoming the abbot of St. Vincent Archabbey is quite a quite a responsibility, a daunting task to say the least. So the process is, we've known that Archabbey Douglas was turning 75. That wasn't a mystery. He turned 75 on May 8th. And so we've been preparing for this election for over a year, just discussing what it means to be abbot and trying to think creatively about who could fulfill the requirements of being abbot. Everybody knows that there's no Archabbey Douglas in this community other than Archabbey Douglas. He is a uniquely talented individual who has done incredible things over the last 30 years that are really impossible to parallel. He's just built so much, developed so much, has just moved St. Vincent in big ways. So we knew we couldn't elect his rightful successor, as it were, someone with all the same gifts and talents. But how do we? Who could we elect? What's really necessary? What do we want to see in an abbot? Those kinds of things. We started preparing through small group meetings, through large community meetings, discussions, just to try and get all of that reflection flowing for us. There's no campaigning, and really nobody wants to be the abbot. So there was no focus on individuals or names, but really looking at the qualities of the office, about the nature of the community, about the challenges that confront us in more general terms, reflecting on what it means to be abbot. We don't have primaries and political debates and anything like that. And it would be, in fact, it's specifically forbidden to have any campaigning. And so, just in a very general way. Now, we know the monks of our monastery and we know the people who have the capacity. Some certainly do not have the capacity to be the abbot of this monastery. Some do. And so, there's, sort of a small pool of potential candidates in people's minds. And we also discussed over the last year, what do you think about this person? What do you think about this person? Just in an informal way, trying to get our ideas around who might be the abbot. But then, uh, we enter into the abbatial election, and we started that Monday evening with nominations. So we actually come into it's a kind of conclave. It's a confidential setting. So I'm not going to, and I can't reveal any details about how that unfolded, but just the general process. Because all of those who are in solemn vows, and that's, if you remember from previous podcasts, a monk of our monastery makes solemn vows after basically 4 years in formation. So 4 years after entering the monastery, we're eligible for solemn vows. So all the monks who have been in for at least 4 years have made solemn vows, are part of the monastic chapter. And the word for chapter in Latin is capitus or capit, coming from the head. Caput is the head. So the person who belongs to the chapter is called a capitular. Anyway, it's a funny word. But all of the capitulars gather together in the chapter to elect an abbot. And we begin with nominations. Every monk can make 2 nominations among the eligible members of the community. Who is eligible to become an abbot? Anybody who is a priest in solemn vows for at least 8 years. Those are the requirements. Uh, it's possible to try and do other things, but that gets more complicated. But those are the basic requirements. Anybody who's a priest and in solemn vows for 8 years. So then we make 2 nominations, and they made a decision to cut off nominations at, well, basically to identify as candidates anybody who got at least 10 nominations. So then, among those who received at least 10 nominations, uh, or anyway, the next phase of the election is to go into what's called a scrutinium. That's again a kind of funny Latin word related to scrutiny. We're going to evaluate or look closely at each of the candidates. And so we enter into that period, starting with the one who got the most nominations down to the one who got the least nominations. And one at a time, those who are nominated leave the room and the remaining monks talk about them. And that's a process which could, could yield interesting results. You know, Generally, one would hope that in a monastic community with those who are professed to follow Christ, who is love, you'd have very charitable discussions honestly evaluating what the candidates are like and not arbitrarily throwing mud or making accusations. And so that can be a very fruitful, very beautiful process of really seeing. One of the unique things about St. Vincent is we have members of the monastery who have been out of the monastery, who haven't been living here, and Archabbey Martin Bartle is an example of that. He's been working in parishes. Recently, the pastor of St. Francis Cabrina in Aliquippa. He's been working in parishes for the last 20 years. And so I overlapped with him maybe 2 years in the monastery, and then he's been out in parishes ever since then. Um, other men have been living here, but then we have our own parish fathers who have been out in parishes or who have been in foreign apostolates like Brazil and Taiwan, who wouldn't necessarily know the men who are living in the monastery. So in some ways, there's a process of getting to know the candidates through the scrutinium. And so that forces us to talk about some of the details. How have they done out in the parishes, or what are their responsibilities in the monastery, and how do they live those out? And those who work more closely, somebody who works in the college is going to work more, is going to be better known by others who work in the college. Someone who works in the seminary is going to be better known by others who work in the seminary. And so those testimonies about the viability of different candidates for abbot are really enlightening. They're really important for us to understand who these men are and what qualities they have and whether they would make a good abbot. Also, at this particular, somebody who might make a good abbot abstractly may not make a good abbot right now at this point in history. Archabbey Douglas, for all of his great gifts, also obviously has some shortcomings, and we may very much want an abbot who kind of balances out some of his shortcomings. Or we may want an abbot who really has similar gifts and can move things forward in that way. So, evaluating what the community needs and evaluating what the candidate has also kind of go together in that process of scrutinium. And a lot of that comes out in the discussion and helps us kind of get a focus on who might be the best candidate at this point in time.
Yeah, so obviously a fascinating process that you guys just went through. And kind of thinking back through it, I remember you explicitly saying you didn't want to be the abbot, and and it makes it a little interesting in the fact that you said that you can't do campaigning, and I inferred that as meaning in the affirmative of trying to get the position. Can you do it in the reverse as far as removing yourself from contention? I know that you guys said that when you did your nominees list, you know, my assumption by not campaigning is you didn't have the guy give a little spiel before he left the room. You just left, and then you guys said as you would. So my question is are you permitted to remove yourself from being an option?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of real nice observations there, Joe. The um, in terms of, you know, most of the time, somebody who is viable as a candidate for abbot is probably, unless there's a real impediment. Some folks have, all of us have skeletons in the closet in one way or another. So, some have some kind of serious things, not so serious that they should be in jail or something, but maybe serious enough that it could cause problems if things came out after the fact. That kind of thing, or for other reasons, maybe that they don't want to advertise. Somebody might not feel up to being abbot. Um, so, in terms of dissuading people from promoting them, certainly anybody can do that. Now, I would say anybody who wants to become abbot probably shouldn't be anyway. I mean, it's like you don't know what you're talking about. There's a kind of willingness to take on a heavy yoke. I think that's maybe the best we could ever do. So, but there is uh, a man does not have to accept the position even if he's voted in. And so what happens is after the nominations, each of the nominees is asked, if you were elected, would you accept? And he can at that point say, no, I wouldn't. And so there's no reason to do the scrutiny for him. And so there is that. And likewise, we could elect him anyway, even if he said, I don't want to do that. And in that case, we would actually, if he got a number of votes, we would stop the voting process and do the scrutiny anyway, because he's in the process of being elected. Now, if he were actually elected, he could again say, I don't want to do it. And that's the final say. So nobody is ever forced to be abbot in our process. Um, but again, yeah. So the candidate can always remove his name. The candidate can always, tell people not to vote for him or something like that beforehand. That's certainly never a problem. After the nominees are identified, and then after the scrutinium takes place and is finished, then the voting begins, and there's no other formal discussion that takes place. We just start voting. The first three ballots, the person has to get 2/3 of the votes to be elected. So that's a pretty substantial, there were 138 electors, I think, and so somebody needed 92 votes from our community, which is a pretty big number in those first three ballots. After those first three ballots, then we have three more ballots where you just need a 50%, a simple majority. You have to get 50% of the votes plus one. And so whatever that is, 60, 69 or something in our case, or 70. So uh, so it really forces the community to come together and listen to each other and listen to the Holy Spirit. And then generally what happens if you have three, four, five, six candidates even that uh, maybe the first three ballots, you're sort of figuring out, well, kind of all the votes gather around these two candidates, and then there's some melt away from the other candidates and focusing on those two, and then you almost certainly kind of narrow it down to two, and then in the last three ballots you're almost certainly going to have an election at that point. If for some reason you couldn't elect somebody in six ballots, then the process is delayed for another 6 months and an administrator is appointed. And that's an indication that there's a real division in the community. There's an unwillingness to move toward one candidate or another. Some group is set on this one, another group is set on this one, and nobody's budging. And probably to not even get over 50%, there has to even be a third candidate involved who's taking away some of the votes from that. And so if that can't resolve itself, that's pretty serious. And then the community really needs to do some work in understanding kind of where the roadblock is in all of that. So overall, a very healthy process, or it should be. For a healthy community, it's a very healthy process. I found it to be, it's very intense. We gathered together basically Monday evening for several hours, and then Tuesday morning, Tuesday afternoon, we finished the scrutinium, uh, and then Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday evening, we're voting, and then finish the voting process with an election. And you really feel like you had a workout. And I found it really useful because transitioning, Archabbey Douglas is the only abbot that I've known, and really making the transition. Although mentally I started preparing a year or more ago, going through that intense process. The only thing I can compare it to is like it felt Wednesday felt like Easter Sunday. It was like I had been through the Triduum, the intensive liturgies of Holy Week, and then it's like you arrive after having done something on Easter Sunday, and there's a kind of opening up of a fresh air. So it really did help transition and also help the community to come together to formulate a kind of vision, what we're getting from Archabbey Martin, what we're seeing in him and hoping for from him. And now another process unfolds, which is Archabbey Martin gets to assign the monks however he wants to, and so he's in a process now of assessing where St. Vincent is, where the needs might be. He certainly has to replace himself at Francis Cabrini in the parish, and then is going to be moving some people around, people who are ready to change positions, things like that. And so we enter into another kind of intense period of discernment as he exercises his authority now as the abbot.
Yeah, and a couple of thoughts are coming from that. And I think that having listened to this, I think that some people might be correlating how is this similar or different from when we elect the Pope or when the Cardinals elect the Pope. And I think that the biggest difference that I'm getting between this is the size of the familiarity that you guys all have with each other. You know, in the sense that the majority of you are living together there. You're staying in this one place and you have familiarity. And I think that that's something that's different. And then obviously the structural rules will be modified, certainly. But the process of going through and just saying, this is who we choose and why, and having a good orderly process to it, I think is very beneficial. And it certainly cannot help hurt the fact that you guys all are already priests. So the fact that you guys are able to sit down and have conversations that are, essentially starting from a point of faith is a lot different than if you look at something going through the primaries or a general election with the government, and just how different that is. And I think also the fact that you guys aren't saying this is one vote forever, and that you guys are revisiting it. And in a sense, the structural element to that was similar to how the various sports leagues elect their Hall of Famers. You have to have X percentage of the person to be able to get to the next level, and then there's more scrutiny, and then do they get in or not? Obviously, there's a lot more stakes involved, which gets to where you were saying about the intensity of thought. Voting for Dermontti Dawson to be in the Hall of Fame versus being your abbot are two very different things. If the left guard gets in the Hall of Fame, that doesn't necessarily affect your life ever again. So I appreciate you letting us know, and the thought that was coming to me, that you saying of how emotionally and mentally tired you were from it, to me shows how important it was, because I think all of us can relate to somewhere in our own lives when you're just thinking and getting all emotionally enveloped, how when it's over, how there's just a exhaustion to it. Some people will get that going through through a funeral type situation. People will get through it just trying to cram for finals, in all various things, to take the emotional and the kind of mental extremes there. So I definitely appreciate you sharing with this, and I'm sure it's something that has a lot of people out there thinking about. And the other part of it that I wanted to mention is, you said in there something I thought was very important. If it's a job that you want, you probably shouldn't have it. And I think that there's a lot of things out there that people just want to have power for the sake of power. And oftentimes that's not going to yield you the right person, regardless of what the committee is. And I think that you see that a lot with, at least I do, a lot with small governments. The guy who really, really wants to be president of the PTA is probably the last guy you should have picked, type deal. And, I think that there's a lot of emphasis on thinking that through and doing the discernment in prayer. As I can imagine, you guys had many masses to sit down and think about this. As you've mentioned, you've been thinking about this for a year. It's had to creep in your mind at least once or twice sitting in front of the tabernacle there. So I don't want to take up the last comments here. I want to give you a chance to conclude today's episode.
Ooh, thanks, Joe, and great points. You're right on the mark in thinking about those different comparisons. I'll just make a quick comment that most other religious orders only elect a man for a period of time, like 6 years. And in contrast, when we elect an abbot, it's till age 75, and then he also retains that blessing. So still refer to Archabbey Douglas. He will always be an abbot. He's blessed as an abbot, and that's really a lifelong designation. I don't. My vow of obedience has transferred now to the new abbot, but he still has the dignity of the office that he carries. So it's a very big deal, and this is something that makes us kind of uniquely Benedictine. It's a kind of monastic thing as opposed to Dominicans or Franciscans or Jesuits who would elect for a period of time, a little bit more like the presidency, where you have a term of office, and that would be a more distinctive period of time. And then I would just say, please pray for Archabbey Martin. He's really got a big job ahead of him, and I think he's a great man, and I'm really grateful for how the election turned out. As I said, I didn't know him as well. I got to know him in part through the scrutinium, and of course, I got to know him from people that I really trust and know, people that I have lived with for 20 years and am very close with. And of course, I knew him when he was here together with me, and I have had some interactions with him over the last 20 years. But um, I really I think highly of him, and I'm grateful that the Lord gave him to us as our abbot. But he certainly needs a lot of prayer. So I already promised him of my prayer, and I'll promise him of our listeners' prayers as well.
Well, we certainly will do that. And to all our listeners out there, we thank you for listening. We thank you for continuing to tell your friends about it as we're growing and the numbers each week reflect that. So we thank you guys for being with us, and we'll be with you again next week.